Welcome to Then and Now, brought to you by the UCLA Luskin Center for History and Policy. We are dedicated to studying change in order to make change, linking knowledge of the past to the quest for a better future. Every other week, we interview thought leaders, historians, researchers, and policymakers about what happened then and what that means for us now.
Welcome to Then and Now, sponsored by the Luskin Center for History and Policy at UCLA. I'm David Myers. I teach in the UCLA Department of History and direct the Luskin Center, whose goal is to bring the past into conversation with the present, and in doing so, to understand how we got where we are so that we can imagine alternative and better futures. Today is Monday, November 16th, nearly 2 weeks after the 2020 presidential election. The election produced, or so it would seem, clarity about the voters' preference for president. But so much else about the election, from the stalled transfer of presidential power to the down-ballot outcomes, raises rather than answers questions. 8 days before the election, Then and Now held a conversation with Lynn Vavreck and Yaroslavsky about what to expect. Now we are gathering again to see how things actually turned out. This time we're joined by Lorrie Frasure, who is Associate Professor of Political Science and African American Studies at UCLA, where she serves this year as the Acting Director of the Ralph Bunche Center for African American Studies. Welcome to you, Lorrie. It's great to have you.
Thank you.
And to refresh your memories, Lynn Vavreck holds the Marvin Hoffenberg Professorship in American Politics and Public Policy at UCLA and has written 5 books and many articles about American politics, especially presidential politics. She's also a leader of Nationscape, one of the largest public opinion survey projects ever undertaken in this country. And Yaroslavsky is the director of the Los Angeles Initiative at the Luskin School of Public Affairs at UCLA. Zev is known to many as an elected official who served for 40 years on the LA City Council and LA County Board of Supervisors from 1975 to 2014. At UCLA, Zev teaches, conducts research for the Luskin Center for History and Policy, and oversees an annual quality of life survey for the LA Initiative. Welcome back, Lynn and Zev.
Thanks, David.
Thank you.
So let's jump right in. Can you three give us your best assessment of where we are at today, 2 weeks after the election? If you were observing the spectacle that is American politics from Olympian heights, what would you be seeing? Let's begin with Lynn.
Okay. Well, am I allowed to say that I think we are at a different place than I thought we would be when we talked 8 days ago? So if you had said to me 2 weeks after the election, what would be going on?
Yeah.
I don't think I would have anticipated the president-elect on television having a conversation about COVID and a vaccine that's 95% effective. And basically the outgoing incumbent president, pouting and refusing to concede. I expected there to be much more of a contestation about what the election outcome actually was. I expected there to be sort of real deep dives into allegations of fraud. And the fact that we've moved past that all relatively quickly is surprising to me.
Lorrie, what does it look like to you?
If I was from the mountaintop looking down, I would say that the American people are ready to move forward. We're both exhausted, right, from an election cycle that had many twists and turns, but during a pandemic where African American and Latinos were deeply impacted, their communities were deeply impacted by the pandemic, but we've seen these communities show up in ways in which I would have predicted, right? Because we know that even for some of the communities that are the most impacted in past eras of protests that was going on around the country, from the likes of which we haven't seen since the 1960s and 1970s, we know that these groups still end up saving our democracy, as we saw in this year in 2020. And so again, I do know that a lot of folks are weary and ready to move forward, ready to get get focused on figuring out how to move their families forward in the face of the coronavirus. And they want, a set of elected officials who are going to position their interest.
So, Zev, those are two relatively rosy assessments of where we're at. Lynn says less constant contestation than one might expect. Lorrie says, it's clearly a signal to move forward. Let's bring it back to you to see the glass as half empty.
You know me too well, David. Well, when the election was declared on Saturday a week ago, I was not euphoric. I was very happy that Biden won. I was not happy that 72 million people voted for an incumbent president who spent 4 years trafficking in racism, bigotry, attacking the First Amendment of the Constitution in myriad ways, the journalists, the courts, bringing religion into the White House in a way that he didn't believe in, but that others did. So I went to bed that night asking myself, what kind of country do we live in? I thought this would not be, I thought that if Biden won by 5 or 6 million votes, which it looks like that's what he's going to win by, that there wouldn't be a lot of close, in the battleground states, there wouldn't be a lot of very close races. The polls were generally accurate in most of the battleground state races. I think that's important to note. They were all not all, but most of them within the margin of error. But I was surprised that Wisconsin was as close as it was, that Michigan was as close as it was. I was pleasantly surprised that Georgia turned out to be, to have the outcome it did. But it was too damn close. And let's not forget that less than 100,000 votes, perhaps, Lynn would know, Lorrie would know, I think it's less than 100,000 votes would have swung this election in a different direction. And yeah, I lose a little sleep at night wondering what this country would be like if that election had turned out differently. I would also say I was, and I think we discussed this in our last podcast, that if the electoral college vote was one-sided, which it turns out it is, that it would be hard for Trump to make a case about fraud. I think one thing we should recognize is that the election process and the people who administered it did a bang-up job. Let's remember, this was in the middle of a pandemic where we had volunteers, hundreds of thousands of volunteers all over the country administering this election. And there really isn't any credible allegation of fraud. There may be a mistake here or a mistake there, but and I felt that if the Electoral College was decisive, that Trump would not be able to make a credible case, and he's not able to make a credible case. And as we speak, some Republicans, too few, but some Republicans, including some of his own staff in the White House and the West Wing, are trying to bring us to closure on this, which is long overdue.
So how do you see this resolving? At this moment, it's Monday, still no concession, tweets after the initial tweet, I think on Saturday, saying Biden won, then denying that Biden won, still the denialism that has characterized Trump's behavior since the election. How do you see this resolving, and on what kind of timeline?
No concession ever. I just don't see it coming. It's not how he's built. Yeah.
I mean, this is what Bart Gellman said. The one thing you can expect from Trump is, never to concede or surrender. He laid out that very dystopian vision of what would unravel after the election, which doesn't seem to be occurring, but still the process of the transfer of power needs to move forward. What Is it a matter of another week? Is it a matter of the electors gathering on December 14th? Is it January 6th? What do you think? I mean, I know it's very hard to predict, but what do you think this is? Where is this heading, and on what timeline?
Well, let me pipe in here. I think it's resolving itself as we speak. I don't. I mean, there is a large body of our population that believes this election was stolen. They believe anything that comes out on that tweet from the White House. But slowly but surely, responsible people on the other side of the aisle, the other side of my aisle, which would be the Republicans on the other side, are starting to come to the mountain on this. I agree with Lynn. He's not going to concede, and I don't really, honestly, I don't care if he concedes. I do care about a rational transition process, and the longer this goes on, where the national security establishment is not permitted, the COVID people, such as they are in his administration, Fauci can't talk to Joe Biden. He's instructed not to talk to Joe Biden. The longer that goes on, the more it undermines, I believe, national security and national health. But I suspect that's going to resolve itself sooner rather than later as well. I don't expect he's going to come to the inauguration, which we just as
I don't
well.
think so either. I don't think so either.
And this is the piece that keeps us up at night. And I do wish that the other side of the aisle, that the Republicans would speak louder and faster. If they're waiting to shore up the base or solidify the base for Georgia, that's putting our country at stake. So I do wonder how fast will people get the courage and the backbone to speak up, because we really do need resources for the transition and for folks to begin to get in place. And this is one of the upshots, if you will, of a Biden presidency, because he is familiar with the terrain and the road ahead. So that should give us a little bit of comfort, but it still does not move along the process to securing the nation, to securing our democracy, to securing a transition during this time as fast as we would hope. But I don't think the Biden campaign ever expected concession.
Right. So I'm wondering if there's anything to which we can compare this current moment in American political history. Has the divide between Republicans and Democrats, between supporters of one candidate and supporters of the other, ever been so vast? I mean, I guess going back to the Union and the Confederacy and the Civil War. Zev, you probably have the longest personal memory here. Does this resonate with anything that you've read as a student of history or experienced in your political life?
Well, when I last talked to Rutherford B. Hayes, I don't think in the last 150 years, I'm not a student of American history the way my colleagues on the call are, but I do remember studying that 1876 election, and that was a mess. I don't, in my lifetime, there's never been anything like this on a very, very minor scale. It wasn't minor at the time. The 2000 election between Gore and Bush, that certainly was a blood pressure raising moment or month, but that worked out. So some of us believe that election was stolen, but maybe not. It came down to 500 or so votes and hanging chads. So that kind of stuff happens. So I don't know of any. Certainly not in modern times anything of this kind. There have been tensions in transitions for sure. There were tension between Eisenhower and Kennedy. There was tension between Clinton and George W. Bush, although nothing like this, and maybe not even like the 1960 transition. But it's this is this has longer term implications. The longer this goes on, the more it calcifies this divide and this inability of either side of this contest to be able to come come to the table and actually get the work on behalf of, to work on behalf of the people of the country. We didn't talk yet about the Senate races. I mean, the pollsters were right about the presidential. They were considerably off on some of the Senate races. And I think that was a surprise to me. I would have thought Biden wins comfortably in Maine. I thought Susan Collins would not win by 10 points. Every poll showed her losing by single digits, and she wins by 10 points. And the implications of having a Senate, it's not over yet, obviously, because of Georgia, but the implications of having a Senate that is still controlled by Mitch McConnell, I worry about whether Biden is going to be, how much Biden is going to be able to accomplish in his term. It can be very difficult for him.
So maybe
I'm going to play that. I just got to play the devil's advocate a little bit, David. Like, just to throw out there for everyone to consider that I don't think the vastness of the conflict is that unusual right now. There have been close elections in many of our lifetimes, 2000, 76, 68, 60, and a lot of those were hotly contested on really, really important ideas. And if you just want to think about like how courageous the parties are, or like where's the lack of character in these past elections that we're seeing today, that 1960 election, you got a Democratic Party that is divided. You've got Northern Democrats basically capitulating with what Southern Democrats are doing, and like, to quote the president-elect, like, come on, man, like, where's the courage? Now, eventually, Northern Democrats are going to step up in that election. But, I don't think it's fair to say that there weren't elections, even in our lifetimes, that had divides that were as important and as vast, sometimes even intra-party divides.
I agree with that, but the role that social media and the national platform for which this is taking is concerning. So yes, we've had divides within the party, and I do worry, Zev, about divided government in this way, and 4 more years or 6 more years of a Senate that is really making it difficult in a myriad of ways for any progressive change to happen. But both Tuesday night, I remember Tuesday night, not just the national mood, but the international mood of uncertainty. And then a Thursday, right, wasn't just a national celebration in the streets, right? I'm not so sure we've seen that before, almost similar to the toppling of an authoritarian regime, right? Mm-hmm. And I'm saying that because many people felt that way, not just in the U.S., but internationally, and the role that social media plays in putting on the national stage where we are and airing our dirty laundry. How long will it take us to really come to grips with this and how we are being, how we're seen on the national stage, and really to undo some of the damage?
So, this leads me, yours and Lynn's perspectives leads me to ask about your discipline, the discipline of political science, and what it can tell us. Because I've been following a bounty of literature in the field of political science that has been warning about a precipitous decline in all sorts of markers of democratic institutions and principles. Zyblatt and Levitsky and Yascha Mounk and Jason Stanley. And I, of course, remember Juan Linz's ominous warning from 1990 about the perils of presidentialism, a system where so much power could be aggregated in one person as opposed to a parliamentary system. So I'm just wondering how you fit yourselves into existing literature and political science, especially around the death of democracy motif, which seems to be so pronounced today. Lorrie?
Well, I guess I take a more, not necessarily optimistic view, but because I study racial ethnic politics, and I know that groups who came out to, for lack of a better word, or the best word, to save democracy, we've been here before, right? In the face of, voter suppression, of the 1950s, 60s, and even before, in the face of poll taxes and other kinds of suppressive tactics, that groups have showed up to ensure that their voices will be heard at the ballot box. And so in terms of our democracy, when I look at the numbers, and I do have to say a little bit of something, I do want to answer your question, David, but I have to say something about the way we're viewing exit polls. And I think some of the questions around exit poll data, and in the coming weeks and months and years, we will have better data, right? Some of which Lynn has been collecting for many months now. My survey, the Collaborative Multiracial Post-Election Survey, will be going in the field at the end of the month, which is 22,000 cases, which is a nationally representative sample for many of the cases, and an oversample of groups that are largely understudied. Native Americans, which are very important in this election, Asian Americans, Latinos, and African American groups. I wanted to note just that for the national election polls and for the viewers who have been utilizing the New York Times and CNN exit polls, we all try to eat up as much data as possible because we're trying to keep our finger on the pulse, especially during the week of the election. But that survey, the exit poll conducted by Edison Research Group of 15,000 voters, is not a pure nationally representative sample. It's a cluster sample, right? And we do know that we want to point out that many of these exit polls that are surveying folks at the precinct level, whether that's those coming out of the polling place or those voters who voted early and they're being polled over the telephone, are a systematic overrepresentation of racially homogenous precincts. This is what those cluster samples do. We all eat them up. We use them to teach. We sometimes use them to talk to the media and the press, but it's not until much later do we begin to get better data so we can tell a better story, particularly about how folks voted across different identities, race, ethnicity, gender, and others. So again, we do need to have better oversamples of minority precincts, right? When we're looking at exit polls, we need to question which precincts are being examined versus which precincts are being left out of the exit polls. We do know that these kinds of samples, because of racial segregation and without a random sample of precincts nationwide, that it really skews to middle and upper income groups, people who are English dominant, not limited English proficient groups. And we do know that finally exit polls don't necessarily always have bilingual interviewers, right? So this leads me to suggest that while we are disentangling these polls, particularly across race and gender, there were a myriad of other election eve polls like that was taken by a consortium of scholars, Latino Decisions, Asian American Decisions, the African American Research Collaborative, did an election eve poll of 15,000 voters, which was a nationally representative poll. They had been in the field for weeks before and right up until the eve of the election. And so I just wanted to note that there is data available right now at our fingertips that is more representative than the exit poll data that we're all using and consuming.
So let me just ask you, did those data show what to many in sort of the broader public turned out to be quite surprising, which is to say the very substantial Latino turnout for Trump and the rise, small but nonetheless noticeable rise in support for Donald Trump amongst African-American men?
Mm-hmm. So first let me take, and I'm going to turn it over to Lynn and Zev, but I want to answer the question, Dave, about the polls as they disaggregate by race and gender. First, African-American men have always, African-American women have always outpaced African-American men in terms of their vote choice and voter turnout, right? So we can look at the elections of 68, 84, other kinds of elections, 2 or 3 in our nation's history since 1948, where African-American men have outpaced in terms of the support for the Democratic Party. But it's still been largely 9 in 10 Black women and 8 in 10 Black men, right? And so again, African-American men in the 2016 election Trump voted for Trump by about 16 percentage points. In this election, we have, when you look at some more nationally representative polls, African-American men voted for Trump, voted for Biden, at 86%, and Black women at 92%. Again, a little bit over 8 and 10 and over 9 and 10 for the African-American electorate. For other groups, we do see a better spread than what will be offered in polls, and I can come back to that and give you the numbers for Latinos and Latinos in just a second. But I just wanted to note that here we are here for the African American Research Collaborative poll, which was a American Election Eve poll that was put together by Latino Decisions, Asian American Decisions, and African American Research Collaborative. They do show that 70% of Latinos voted in favor of Biden, 89% of Blacks, 68% of the Asian American Pacific Islander community, 60% of the American Indian community, and 41% of the white community voted in favor of Biden. And again, this survey was taken in multiple languages, is a nationally representative sample and an oversample of communities of interest, particularly African Americans, which exit polls do not oversample. So just trying to give the listeners a little bit more of a context for how the exit polls that we so readily use could possibly overestimate in some terms and underestimate the turnout when you disaggregate by race and ethnicity.
I really appreciate that. And I'm sure Lynn would love to jump in, but if you could just indulge me for 1 second, Lynn, and address the earlier question about the death of democracy. From your opening comments, I take it you're not a devotee of that particular tradition or don't sign on to that proposition.
Yeah.
Could you just speak to that for a minute before we get back to polls, which I know we're going to want to spend some time?
Sure. What you've done here, David, by inviting Lorrie and me is you've sort of jammed yourself up on two dimensions. The first is that at baseline, you've got a couple of people who are problem solvers all the time. So you're always going to hear us saying like the glass is half full and we can make it fuller. And the second thing is, I think that I agree. We both study political behavior. And so we're not scholars of institutions, but I agree that the institutions really do matter. And I think that those institutions are strong, the democratic institutions. And Lorrie mentioned several of them. I wouldn't disagree with any of that. And I would say even the other ones, Zev mentioned earlier, the election administrators, which if you really had to think about federalism and how loopy it is, the way that we administer elections in this country would be one of the leading contenders for loopiness. But again, the heroic efforts by all of these people in a time of a pandemic to come out and administer these elections. The very fact that this is a historic election in that an incumbent president whose party has been in power for only one term got ushered out of office. That rarely happens in American politics. And so, talking about things that in our lifetimes are super rare, well, that's one of them. And that regularly scheduled free and fair elections are a democratic institution, a really important one. And they worked really well this time. So I am also not a pessimist on this.
I can just Can I bring in the pessimist view? I have to represent the pessimist caucus.
That's your assignment.
That's who I am. Is there anyone who doubts that if Trump had another term, that our democracy would not have been in jeopardy? I believe it with all my heart, with all my guts. With people like Bill Barr running the Justice Department, with judges who fortunately didn't have to be tested as to their loyalty to Trump because the election was sufficiently decisive. I think we were cruising for some real trouble. And by the way, we still have 60 some odd days left. This guy is still in the White House. I wouldn't completely stop holding my breath about this. So there are two things I want to just touch on. One is that, we talked in our last podcast, David. I made the comment, I think I did, that while Democrats are working real hard to get their vote out, and they did, and that's the reason, for reasons that Lorrie discussed, that made the difference in Wisconsin and probably in Michigan, certainly in Pennsylvania, and in Georgia, and probably in Arizona and Nevada as well. But the Senate, I have to say, there's one difference between 1960 and 2020. The minority leader of the United States Senate at that time, the Republican leader, was Everett Dirksen. Lyndon Johnson, for a lot of reasons, was able to craft, after the Kennedy assassination, was able to craft both a Civil Rights Act and a Voting Rights Act, because he was able to go and cajole Everett Dirksen to bring a few of his Republicans along. Is there any of us who believe that Mitch McConnell is willing or capable of doing that? I don't. I think he's going to be right back where he was some years ago, when he said his job is to make this guy a one-term president, and he did everything possible to frustrate the new president, Barack Obama. Now, we have some things on our agenda. We've got COVID. We've got an economic crisis, which most of us have survived so far, but it won't go on forever. We have to address the issue of voting rights. I look at what happened here, despite all of the yeoman's work that our volunteers and our poll workers did. The fact is that in Texas and in Georgia and in a number of other states, I believe in Wisconsin, there were efforts made, very transparent efforts, to suppress the vote, putting one drop box in all of Harris County, Houston, Texas. And there was nothing that anybody could do about it. One of the things I was hoping for was that the Democrats would take over the Senate, and one of the first things on the agenda should be addressing the national election, not just infrastructure, but the national election policies, and resurrect the Voting Rights Act, which was allowed to expire on a whole lot of levels. That's not going to happen if McConnell is still the majority leader. So I'm not. I am a student of history from the greatest public university in the country, UCLA, and I'm worried about it. I'm worried that while we got our vote out, Trump got his vote out in a way. In some places, he outperformed the Democrats in a big way. Hidalgo County in Texas and the Rio Grande Valley, he got 40 some odd thousand more votes than he did 4 years ago. Biden got 12,000 or thereabouts more votes than Hillary got. So when you guys get into your data, those kinds of things would be real interesting. Why was Wisconsin so close? Why was Pennsylvania so close? Weren't supposed to be, because he got his vote out.
It's so close, right? It's party politics, don't you think so?
Yeah, no, and I totally,
what it is.
I totally agree. It's party politics, and if that party had prevailed, there is no evidence that has been shown in the last 4 years that there is an Everett Dirksen or a Hugh Scott, another Republican leader in the Senate in the 60s. There isn't one of them among the current Republican crop. Not Susan Collins, who never bolted from Mitch McConnell when he needed her vote. Mitt Romney is still a work in progress. Otherwise, it's been radio silence from those folks. So I'm concerned about it. I'm not jumping off the Golden Gate Bridge, but I think not to recognize that we came very close it keeps me up at night.
Look, Lynn would say, and she's going to speak in her own words in a second. We've had divided elections, time after time after time. But Lynn, you did note the sort of loony, crazy federalist system of elections. The Washington Post editorialized 2 days ago, I think, for the abolition of the Electoral College. There are clearly structural flaws in the system that are rendering at least a substantial part of it dysfunctional or unfair or inaccessible to many. And then you have the proposition, which sort of operates at the meeting point between political behavior and institutions, the specter of one team in the game not playing by the rules, refusing to play by the rules, which your colleagues in political science say is a telltale sign of the decline of the democratic game as we know it. So are these not new data points that temper somewhat your otherwise sanguine view of things?
I had factored them in. When I said that election administration, was potentially the loopiest of the Federalist implications, I actually didn't mean the Electoral College, which I'm kind of agnostic about, if I'm being honest. That might be a whole separate conversation, but there are some upsides to it. And if you're worried about fraud, the Electoral College is a good mechanism to prevent, fraud swinging the whole thing. I don't want to sound, like a cheerleader, but, and I think that Zev is right on the bargain and compromise thing. And I think there's a really interesting idea here to think about. Why did we see more bargain and compromise in the 60s than we're seeing in the 2020s? And one possibility is that political parties, which are also institutions, they have ideas they want to get enacted into legislation, understood that to get any advances toward any kinds of things they wanted, they needed maybe to bargain and compromise, because control of government was not switching every other term, because one party really did dominate the balance. And so where we are now is really different. We've got two parties. They are internally homogenous. They're very different. It's very easy for people to tell them apart. That wasn't the case in the 1960s, really. And they think that each of them thinks that they're out of power right now and they can win in 4 years. So why bargain and compromise today if I can just hold out for 3 more years and then I get everything I want? And so that is a little bit also, I think, of what's limiting this bargain and compromise. But that really isn't about the death of democracy, in my view.
Mm. Right. Lorrie, what do you think about some of the structural flaws of the system? The Electoral College, whether or not one team is playing by the rules, the Federalist system, this sort of crazy 51 unit system to arriving at election results. How does it look to you?
I'm not in any way optimistic that there's going to be an abolishment of the Electoral College anytime soon. So and that is, that's something that we're confronted each year with our students with questions of the Electoral College, not just how it works, but if there's any chance of moving towards another system. And I'm not optimistic that that's going to happen. We've been here before. Usually after every election, one side or the other is calling for the abolishment of the Electoral College. And then every 4 years, we're right here back again. I think that if I can go back to Zev's point about the role of voter suppression, the role of moving forward, our feelings about 70 million voters voting in favor of the Republican Party, voting in favor of a second Trump administration. Here is what I think is an understudied persistently, although they have some of the most high quality data. And that is not the elephant in the room that we pointed out necessarily since last Thursday about the role of various racial ethnic groups not giving their 100% commitment behind the Democratic Party, but the extent to which, and there was an interesting Time article today about the role that white men played in the election and in upholding the status quo. So I'd like to suggest, or at least ask, when will we have a conversation, a courageous conversation about the vast majority of whites, particularly white men, in 2016 and 2020, that are responsible for helping to uphold the status quo? When will we begin to disentangle? A lot, and you've heard me speak numerous times, David and Zev and Lynn, about the role that white women play and the role that they played since 1948 in terms of the support of Republican Party candidates in presidential elections. But the group for me this time around, which we're trying to, we need to try to disentangle, not because we're working for a different political campaign and we want to shore up their vote. I'm not here on this podcast to shore up anybody's vote. But as we move forward, questions need to be asked, because I believe that white men were looking at the same president that I was looking at, right, for the last 4 years. And I'm wondering if it registered about the role of American democracy and what's at stake in their households, right? And the extent to which Trump's overtures to suburban white women that you're going to get their men back to work, and all of these other kinds of overtures to Black women, to white women as the security mom, the soccer mom, the suburban mom voter, resonated in particular ways with white men, right? And so I don't think that we're doing our due diligence to better understand what is happening. On the one hand, we can just suggest, oh, those white men are white supremacists and racists, right? Or they're not enlightened, or they're worried about their economic insecurity. But I would argue that when have Black folks not been concerned about their economic insecurity in Ohio, in Pennsylvania, in Michigan, right? In upstate Illinois, or downstate Illinois, I'm sorry, and other kinds of pockets where their financial situation has long been precarious before the pandemic, but those groups still show up in a pandemic in vast numbers in support of the Democratic Party. And so again, I'm trying to get my head around, as a social scientist, how we move away from the pointing of fingers, but we try to better understand what is going on. I'm really perplexed. And I want to say that, party ID and partisanship is going to pop in all of these statistical models, right? But we also are going to need to pay close attention to the role of racial animus, close attention to the role of misogyny, particularly sexism, and a variety of other kinds of factors beyond economic insecurity, for which many folks were facing, right, in the battleground states. So again, if someone could speak to the role that white men and their responsibility and their accountability in this space and in this time, and who's going to stand up and say something about it, because I'm sure that they were witnessing the same thing of living in fear that we were in the weeks and months moving up to the election.
Yeah, it's such an important point, because we tend to focus on, in this election, people focused on, the uptick in support for Trump amongst Latinos, or, the 2% rise in support amongst African-American men. But the people who elect Donald Trump, who elected him in 2016 and voted for him this time in overwhelming numbers, are white men and women. So what do you think would be a profitable line of inquiry? Well, I mean, it sounds like you're pointing to, the racial coding of electoral appeals and the persistence of deeply ingrained racial predispositions. You point out that voters of all races and genders are similarly concerned about economics. So what about, you're calling us to push to the fore deeply ingrained racism, at least in part. What are we to do with that? What do you think what can social science do about that? What should we be thinking about that we're not?
And I'll let other folks jump in here, but we have some of the most longstanding and high quality data on white men, right? But yet after every election, the post-analysis, the autopsy is around what folks of color are doing, and the extent to which they have upheld the American democracy so that we can live to fight another day. But we are not disentangling the hearts and minds, or the political behavior, to not use the word hearts and minds, but the political behavior of white men across race, ethnicity, various kinds of identities, geography. And we assume that their behavior is wrapped up into partisanship, right? And I'm not discounting that is an important marker. But these kinds of what I call courageous conversations, they are going to be had. They need to be had, and I hope that, moving into the off election year, that we learn from this in the same way that we were pushing a greater discussion, a more full-throated discussion among white women and between women of color and white women in the fallout after the 2016 election. But for whatever reason, white men were just left out of the conversation and seemingly excused from the conversation. Here we are again.
If I can interject on that, I totally agree with what Lorrie is saying. And one of the things that our side, I don't think fully appreciated, was that every time Trump,
the pro Biden side, you mean?
The pro Biden side. Is there any doubt? That every time Trump trafficked in dog whistles or bullhorns, as I frequently like to talk about, he was motivating his base. He was growing his base. Macomb County went decisively in his favor. People were thinking maybe with Biden, the moderate centrist lunch pail candidate, that we'd be able to swing Macomb County back to when Obama won it two elections in a row. Didn't happen. Every time he trafficked in that language, we reacted. What a racist, which he is. I reacted. In addition to that, I reacted by saying he's bringing out his vote, and it worked. The only thing that at the end of the day, the reason he fell short is because the Democratic side got its vote out too. And it was quite inspirational. And I think Lorrie was alluding to that as well. People standing in line for 8, 9, and 10 hours to vote. I mean, I saw that in Nigeria when I observed an election there on 2 occasions. 100-degree weather, 99% humidity. I was blown away and I was inspired. I said to myself, that would never happen back home. Well, in a number of places, not necessarily 100-degree weather, but rain and sleet and just
a pandemic.
And the pandemic, which is the overlay of everything that went on, and yet they came out in big numbers. The racial breakdown, the gender breakdown. These 2 incredible scholars will ferret that out for us. But I do believe that white men came out in bigger numbers. I don't have any data, but I have my instincts tell me that, and it wasn't just among whites. There were some communities, not the African American community, but in the Latino community where he appealed to some of them, and they came out in droves. The only thing that saved us in this election was that others on the Democratic side of the aisle of the ledger came out in more droves. This is why I'm nervous. This election is a snapshot in time. Question is where are we going to be in 2 years and in 4 years? And what we should not forget is that there was an article in the Wall Street Journal in the last few days about the lasting impact of the Trump presidency. He has changed what passes for acceptable discourse in our society, and that acceptable discourse now includes misogyny, it includes racism, it includes anti-Muslim rhetoric, anti-immigrant rhetoric, anti-media, anti-judges, the judicial system. He managed to, in a little less than 4 years, undermine public confidence in the very institutions that for the last several generations have been the institutions that were the underpinning of our democracy. Now they're kind of fraying, and we'll see. Joe Biden is a very talented politician, and hopefully he'll be able to work wonders in in his relationship with the senators, I'm not holding my breath for that. But he's no Lyndon Johnson. And in the 1960s are not the 2020s either. And I think this should be a win or lose, but fortunately we won the presidency. It should be a wake-up call to all of us that there's a lot of work that's left to be done.
Okay, Lynn, white men.
Yeah. That's a maybe different podcast. I don't know. But we did do a lot of work in a book that I wrote on the 2016 election called Identity Crisis. We did do a lot of work on the racial attitudes and the role that they played interacting with Trump's messaging among white voters in that election, outlining the kinds of things that Lorrie just talked about, the dramatic way that the messaging sorted people and clarified the politics of race for a lot of people. And so I think that that story is not in the rear view for sure. And in the, whatever it's been, 10 days since the election, I have been doing a lot of preliminary data analysis on all the data we've collected in 2020, trying to figure out what was associated with people shifting. And so you had maybe Clinton voters who shifted to Trump, white voters. And why? Why are they doing that? And, the story about identity, particularly about race, ethnicity, and religion is going to be implicated in those switches again in 2020. So I think that we're well positioned to sort of dig into that, as Lorrie suggests.
Great. We could go on for a very long time, but we'll have to do that on another occasion. I want to conclude by asking a question that figured centrally in our earlier conversation about polling, which Lorrie has already talked about, and we'll hear again from her. Lynn, you told us that polling has gotten a lot better since 2016.
I know, I remember.
We haven't forgotten that. On the face of it,
you aren't wrong.
It certainly seemed like polls didn't do much better, but in fact worse. And yet Zev has called attention to the fact that, in a number of key states, the polls weren't that far off at the presidential level. So I'm wondering what your assessment is of the polling of the 2020 election.
No, it's bleak, man. It's just like, it's not good. And they were, okay, so yes, they're wrong in 2 states, only 2. But
that's
it
Florida,
is the case.
Florida and what? Florida and
North Carolina, maybe?
North Carolina, maybe.
I think that's right. I can't remember off the top of my head. In terms of the sort of aggregators, if you look at the 538 aggregation. But I think that the miss on average is bigger in 2020 than it was in 2016. Yet, the polls in 2016 actually probably do a better job of predicting the 2020 outcome than the 2020 polls did. So there was something really not right about what we thought we were fixing, how it got fixed. And there will be a lot of work done to try to figure out exactly what that is. I think there are a lot of hypotheses. I don't love really any of them. And I think it's just going to take some work, and it almost surely has something to do with the people who are willing to answer polls now. And that's very hard to figure out because, of course, you don't have information about the people who won't talk to you. So if you want to try to compare those 2 groups of people, you're in a little bit of a jam because you don't know very much about the people who won't talk to you, especially if you think that the real difference is, something very attitudinal, like their level of baseline civic engagement or something like this, that you're really going to need survey questions to try to get at. So I think the pollsters are not feeling great, and they're all staring down a lot of hard work. And that includes us, it's everybody who was in the field, really. The turnout model is also probably responsible for some of this, just sort of getting the turnout estimate wrong is definitely responsible for some of the miss, but not all of it.
Yep. Lorrie, what's your takeaway you gave us some ideas of alternative alternatives to the regnant polling model. What's your takeaway about polls and polling as we move forward?
Well, as the electorate continues to diversify and the demographics continue to shift, again, 67% of the electorate was white in the 2020 cycle. That's a growing number of racial ethnic minority groups who are turning out to vote. We're going to continue to push for turnout to the polls, which is different from vote choice, right? But pushing folks to register, mobilizing them to turn out will necessitate the need for different and varying polling strategies, right? That help to overcome some of the shortcomings of the exit polls that I pointed out before with regards to cluster sampling, with regards to the role that precincts play and not having a large oversample of minority precincts, helping us to better understand who's included in the exit poll and who's left out, polling that is diverse across various kinds of limited English proficient folks. And the poll that I shared from the African American Research Collaborative Latino Decisions and Asian American Decisions is a pre-election poll of 15,000 respondents, which includes a nationally representative sample and giving respondents an option to take it in their language of interest, right? And it also oversamples African Americans and other populations of interest. We can do better in terms of polling, right? And we can be better innovators because we know that if you're going to try to poll a diverse electorate, you're going to have to bring to the table a diversity of kinds of modes of inquiry to reach those groups, whether that's telephone, combination of in person at the precinct, if we're able to be in person again, right? But also ways in which we're reaching folks in a new mode with a diverse electorate.
Mm-hmm. Zev, final word. You're the only one amongst us who actually had a pollster on staff to determine his electoral prospects. What's your takeaway about polls coming out of 2020?
Well, I'm not going to, I can't compare it to the knowledge base that you have between Lorrie and Lynn. I did a little analysis before we started this podcast. The places where the polls were really out of whack on the presidential side, they were out of whack a lot on the senatorial side. And that's because the polls on the senatorial races are not as frequent. Some of them go back a ways. But the ones that were really out of whack were Ohio, where there was a 7.2% swing between what was predicted and what ended up happening. Iowa, where there was a 6.2% swing from what was predicted and what happened. Wisconsin. And oddly enough, in Wisconsin, it was a 6% swing. All of these were outside the margin of error. And Pennsylvania, there was basically the polls were not way off on Pennsylvania. And I think part of, and this is not a scholar question or even a pollster question, but it's kind of an optics issue. The way the results came in on election night in the days that followed were bizarre if you are used to following election results over the years. And that was because Democrats voted early. They were encouraged to vote early, and Republicans were discouraged from voting early and voted late. So the states that counted their ballots, the mail-in ballots early, showed an initial result that may have changed or at least narrowed as the days went on, and vice versa. So I think that there's kind of a psychological view that this thing was a little messy. I wouldn't be so hard on the pollsters in this case, because in most of them, even in Florida, it was close. It was on the cusp of the margin of error. Most of the other battleground states, the polls were close. And when it's close, and it can end up, when the polls say plus or minus 4.4% margin of error, that means you can go 4.4% either way. So it's tough, right? It's tough to poll in a presidential election because you got to poll in different states. It's not a national poll for purposes of predicting or what the result is going to be, not for the longer term analysis. But I don't think that the pollsters should fold their tents and go home. I think I don't think they disgraced themselves. I think there was more of I don't know, Lynn. I'm not going to debate it because
No, I don't want to debate it. I just want to say one thing about your margin of error, which is exactly right. But this is why everybody got so interested in poll aggregating, like 4 cycles or 3 cycles ago, was because if any one poll, was off by the +4, then, the next one has just it's by the -4.
Right.
And then if we do, like in a place like Ohio and Wisconsin, there's more polling this time than there was last time because everybody's worried about it. And yet they're all off in the same direction. That's what the aggregating was supposed to help us out of. And so I think it does belie a little bit of something systematic that they got to figure
I agree
out.
with you totally. And I think there's something to be excavated in Wisconsin and Ohio and maybe a little bit in Iowa and a couple other, and yeah, I totally agree. And both 16 and 20 in both elections, it came down to a handful of states, and not that many votes could have tilted the election in the opposite direction. And and I remember a comment that Sherrod Brown made to me in early 2018. He was running for re-election in Ohio, and I asked him, how are you going to win re-election in a state that Hillary lost by 8 or 9 points? And he said, I go back home every weekend and I go to the small towns in Ohio and I go to church on Sunday and I talk to the pastor and I talk to the county commissioner and to the mayor, and I know them all on a first name basis. And then he said, if we don't learn, Democrats that is, if we don't learn how to talk to small town America, we'll win the next election by 5 million votes, popular vote, and we'll lose the Electoral College. Now, he was right about one part of it. He wasn't right about the other part. I'm not sure he really believed that. But I think, I think, Lorrie is right. We've got to walk a mile in the shoes of our political adversaries. They've got to walk a mile in our shoes. It's pretty hard to walk a mile in somebody else's shoes when they're not willing to reciprocate and try to understand what the aspirations and frustrations are of the people who they view as their adversaries and increasingly view as their enemies. That's the challenge that we have. And in my life, I've never seen this kind of a calcified division where you can't get a single Republican senator to stand up and say, the Constitution dictates that we do something. That's the oath we've sworn to uphold. And we can't even bring ourselves to stand by the Constitution. That to me, and that's me. I expended a lot of political capital in my career defending very unpopular positions because that's what the Constitution dictated. Whether it was on freedom of religion, whether it was on voting rights, whatever the case may be, that the Constitution is not written to protect the majority. It's written to protect the minority against the tyranny of the majority. That's the way I see it. It may not have been what it was in 1789, but it certainly is the way I see it in my political career.
Yeah. Here we're talking about the tyranny of the minority, actually.
That's true.
Which believes in minority rule, but not minority rights.
That's right.
Anyway, on that note, in defense of the Constitution, I think we'll have to bring it to an end. It's been a really rich conversation, and it calls out for another one soon when we have even more data and a greater ability to assess the performance of polling and surveys with this exact group. Let me take this opportunity to thank Lorrie, Lynn, and Zev for joining us on Then and Now. It's really been a most illuminating time with you. Thank you to our listeners out there. Let us know your thoughts about this episode or other episodes of Then and Now by emailing us at luskinCenter@history.ucla.edu. And special thanks, as always, to our executive producer, Maya Ferdman. Until next time, wishing you a pleasant and safe day.
Thank you for joining us this week on Then and Now. Then and Now is brought to you by the UCLA Luskin Center for History and Policy, where we study change to make change. For more on our work, follow us on Twitter and Facebook at our handle, @LuskinHistory. Our show is produced by Maya Ferdman and David Myers, with original music by Daniel Reichman. Special thanks to the UCLA History Department for its support, and thanks to you for listening.